when there are internal conflicts and differences that divide us. That's why we have different insurgent groups. Even the MNLF does not agree with all of the things that are stipulated in the BBL draft. That's why it's important for us, for an arbiter to exist, because more groups have shown the willingness to negotiate with government to reach a compromise in making a law that can best cater to everyone's interests. But let's assess what a secession really looks like, because they never really characterize it. Because a secession means becoming a separate state with its own governing laws, police powers, and complete sovereignty, Mr. Chair and members of this House. That means not having any oversight coming from the national government. That means having its own foreign policies, for example. That's different from just being an autonomous political entity or an autonomous region, because these only mean that you're partially independent and you're still dependent, for example, for the national government for budget allocation. And you're still under the laws, for example, that can protect you, for example, from certain things that you might undergo. That's why the clash of opposition is simple. We want for other alternatives to be catered to be exhausted. For example, we're more willing to give them to set up a system of federalism, Mr. President. For example, to set up a autonomous political identity, because in these instances we have a mechanism to intervene. But even if we concede to the idea that these solutions are not perfect, the important thing about our solution is that should there be a mistake or should there be any forms of failure, because it's not a separate state, we can still intervene and make compromises in their behalf. That's why we think that's particularly important for us to do that. We don't want complete independence, we still want for something to arbitrate. But let's assess what are the standards for what we should allow secession, right? Because we think that both sides of this debate will agree that the goal is to make sure that the Bangsamoro becomes a successful, for example, entity in terms of being able to protect, for example, all of the people under its scope. The standards for when we secede is, number one, there must be a coherent identity within those nations, within that particular group. But secondly, we want to ensure that there's no single entity to dominate and oppress people or minorities within that aspect. But that's characterized, right? But this is about a couple of things coming from Prime Minister's speech. Because the entire bulk of arguments was to say, for example, that social injustices exist in status quo. Therefore, we need to be able to provide them, for example, with secession as a mechanism to solve that. But if your problem, for example, is discrimination, if your problem is being excluded, then why is secession the solution to that problem? Because we think there's a mismatch, right? Because if that's their problem, why don't we empower them, for example, through laws that protect them, for example? Or because the assumption is that when we grant independence to the Bangsamoro identity, these social injustices will automatically go away. But that's necessarily true, because within the Bangsamoro itself, there are power imbalances, especially because in and of itself, the Bangsamoro as an identity is not coherent. It's composed of different actors with different power structures, for example, and have different interests and goals, which means that there's more likely to be a monopoly, for example, of how the rights in that particular entity can solve. Right? Please, anybody time. But moreover, let's assess, right, the problem of injustice. Because we think, Mr. Chair, that the source of oppression is because of the Bangsamoro nation being left behind by the national government in terms of policy. They don't feel included, they don't feel prioritized, and they don't feel the opportunity to develop on their own. That's why our alternatives, like federalism manager or autonomous political entities, will work, because it better addresses their needs, for example, and giving them opportunities to be able to develop on their own. But before I argue, yes.
How are you going to tell the people who are the victims of social injustices that federalism is the only solution, while in fact these people does not even conform to the Filipino identity?
We're not defending the only solution, but we're defending, for example, that there are other alternatives for us to make sure that we negotiate, for example, and include the rights and interests of everyone. Because even if they don't share with the Filipino identity, in and of itself, they have divisive identities on their own. Let's talk about my first argument, right? Why they need an arbiter. I already told you that there's no coherent identity, right? That's why we can't give them independence yet. The Bangsamoro entity is composed of different actors with different goals. They have barangay mentality, firstly, where different tribes, for example, are dispute, for example, of which identity is truly moral. We have Tausug, we have Maranao, for example, and different views of what constitutes a nation of Moros. This means that they are likely to group themselves into entities that share their version of what it means to be a Moro, and with people who share the same political goals as them, with varying degrees. But on second analysis, right, in terms of politics, some Moro entities have an interest to only settle for an autonomous region because status quo is convenient in providing them with the power structures they need to stabilize it. While other groups feel more oppressed, for example, that's why the BIFF wants violent, for example, secession wants complete independence. This is why they need an arbiter, which is the state, to facilitate compromises from an objective lens to make sure that all interests are considered. Because in a secessionist state, the ones with a bigger political clout will most likely dominate the discussion and dominate the way that power structures are created in that particular scenario. In that situation, minorities will still feel oppressed and will still resort to fighting for their interests. If we give them independence at a point in time, there's still fundamental divide. It's more likely that conflict will remain, if not worsen, under their model. The harm is that in these scenarios, the state can no longer intervene because these states are sovereign right now. That's why our model is better, because in situations, for example, when a minority is oppressed, within that model, Madam Chair, we think that we have the capability, for example, to protect, for example, the people who are oppressed, the minorities. But on second level, right, because we think, Madam Chair, that the Bangsamoro areas in status quo, moreover, are not just composed of people who share with the Moro identity. There are entities, for example, right now, like Lumads, for example, or like Christians, for example, within those entities, that do not necessarily agree with creating or seceding itself from that particular nation and creating identity that they do not own. So if they agree with the idea that we should not group identities, if they are fundamentally divisive and they're fundamentally different, and they don't identify with that identity, then why do they defend, for example, that kind of grouping under their model and push for independence, even when it's not the ones that we need in status quo? But moreover, we think the entities that compose the Bangsamoro right now are fundamentally opposing what they want, for example, to create, especially the ones who are more powerful, for example, is to impose Sharia law, even to those people, for example, who are moderates, or to those people who do not necessarily believe in those kinds of things. We think that in that kind of model, people will be more likely to be oppressed under the model, especially because it's the nature of Bangsamoro groups right now is very clannish, right? They only care about the people who can, for example, be utilized to preserve their power structures, or for example, people who share the same name or political ideologies as them. That's not sustainable, Madam Chair and members of this House. We need to be able to make sure that peace and order will exist, and that can only happen when we have an arbiter to protect them. ADU is very proud to come back to the finals.